Right, Jeremy Corbyn is the leader of the Labour Party, as you know, and he's got a speech right now on the benefits of staying in the European Union.
As we get closer to what may be a very tight vote, it does not help the debate over such serious issues if the hype and histrionic claims continue, or worse, intensify. I believe that the European Union has the potential to deliver positive change for the people of this country if there was a radical reforming government to drive that agenda in Britain. Too often, what has held back the European Union is having to move at the pace of the slowest, and you don't get much slower than the British Tory government. And let me say this up front to anyone listening who is not already registered to vote. Please register to vote. You have just 5 days left in order to register to vote, particularly for young people who are going to be living the longest with whatever decision is made. Please register to vote. The voting registration can be done online. Please do so. So you've got your democratic possibility of voting then. Just over a week ago, George Osborne claimed that the British economy would enter a year-long recession if we voted to leave. This is the same George Osborne who predicted his austerity policies would close the deficit by 2015. That's now been rescheduled to 2021. It's the old 5-year card trick of George Osborne. It's the same George Osborne who said the British economy would be carried aloft by the march of the makers. Yet the manufacturing sector has stagnated ever since, and manufacturing employment declined. The biggest risk of recession in this country is from a Conservative government that is failing on the deficit, the debt, and failing to rebalance the economy and failing to boost productivity. 2 weeks ago, Boris Johnson claimed, and I have to quote with care here, "It is absurd that we are told that you cannot sell bananas in bunches of more than 2 or 3 bananas." Apart from saying bananas twice in the same sentence, it seems fairly absurd, and I'm tempted to use the name of the same fruit to describe his thoughts on this process. Utterly absurd. The Leave side has conceded a number of myths about the evils of the EU that are frankly nonsense. Let's remind ourselves of the positives. It was European regulation that improved Britain's beaches, which, if you go back 30 or 40 years, were in a terrible state. Britain used to pump our untreated raw sewage straight into the sea. Just 25 years ago, 1 in 4 of the beaches of this country were too dirty to swim from. Now, 95% of our beaches have a clean bill of health because of tough regulations that help not just people in this country, but people all over Europe, because clearly sewage pumped into the sea here can end up in France or Holland, and vice versa. 3 years ago, the European Union voted to restrict the use of some pesticides that are strongly linked to a decline in the bee population. A bee population is absolutely essential for our biodiversity. The coalition government, led by the Tories, lobbied against these restrictions. Thankfully, these restrictions were passed, and I hope are going to be tough. It's going to be tough implementation of them to ensure a regeneration of the bee population and, of course, the biodiversity that goes with it. Too often, the British government has had to be dragged kicking and screaming in order to protect our own environment. The Prime Minister has lurched from his hugger-husky phase when he became Tory leader, a decade on to gassing badgers, and then later on to trying to poison bees. I think he needs to take some eco-lessons on biodiversity and understanding the necessity and the beauty of our natural environment. A recent court judgment ordered the British government to do more to tackle air pollution, and it was the UK Supreme Court in London which acted to enforce EU standards. A recent study found that EU air quality regulations are saving roughly 80,000 lives per year across the whole continent. It's time this government acted to save lives here too. The air quality in London is poor. It's poor in other cities. It has to be improved. We can use EU legislation to improve it. European Union targets have been vital in encouraging the adoption of renewable energy. Some countries, like Germany and Denmark, have embraced this change, invested and revolutionised their energy markets, creating new, high-skilled jobs and leading technological advance. Britain has dragged its heels. So much for David Cameron's rhetoric about leading the greenest government ever. There are other things as well. It's an EU directive that stopped the mobile phone companies from ripping us off if we make or receive a call anywhere in Europe. It was the collective strength of 28 countries representing 520 million people that achieved that. A crucial area is the European Convention on Human Rights that empowers citizens to hold the government to account. This has strengthened our rights as citizens and stopped our government from gagging free speech and a free press. It was the Labour government which wrote the convention into UK law through the very important and seminal Human Rights Act of 1998. Today, senior figures in the Conservative government are discussing repealing the Act, which has ensured the state cannot violate people's rights. It's because of those human rights in law that we actually achieved the inquest into Hillsborough, so that those families finally got justice after 27 years of hard work and campaigning to get a hearing. And congratulations to them, all of them. For the tenacity and the dignity that with which they conduct themselves over all those very long, very difficult years. It's worth reflecting that if this government repealed the Human Rights Act and opted out of the European Convention on Human Rights, it would join Europe's only dictatorship, Belarus, as the only other country not to support universal human rights. A Labour government will restore our human rights in full if they've managed to repeal the Human Rights Act of 1998. On rights at work, this is a very, very important area. Europe, through the social chapter and other directives, has delivered a number of good things. 26 million workers in Britain benefit from being entitled to 28 days of paid leave per year, and a limit on how many hours they can be forced to work through the Working Time Directive. Over 8 million part-time workers, 6 million of whom are women, have equal rights with full-time colleagues. 1 million temporary workers have the same rights as permanent workers. 340,000 women every year have guaranteed rights to take maternity leave. It's important to understand that these gains, it means workers throughout Europe have decent rights at work. It means it's harder to undercut terms and conditions across Europe. And I pay tribute to unions all across Europe, as well as in Britain, that have forced these regulations through and continue to campaign to strengthen them even further. Several Leave supporters have stated clearly they want to leave Europe to water down workers' rights, to rip up the protections that protect work-life balance, that prevent discrimination and prevent exploitation and injustice. That is why we say the threat to the British people is not the European Union. It's a Conservative government here in Britain seeking to undermine many of the good things that unions and other people have achieved in Europe, and resisting changes that would benefit ordinary people in this country. A vote to leave means a Conservative government would then be in charge of negotiating Britain's exit. Everything they've done as a government so far means we could not rely on them to protect workplace rights that millions of people rely on. A Tory Brexit negotiation would be a disaster for the majority of people in Britain who rely on many of these regulations to protect their environment, their consumer rights and their conditions at work. But that is not to say there isn't a case for reform. Because none of us are satisfied with the European Union as it is. We believe Europe can and must do far more to meet the needs of our people. That's why we make the case to remain. We also make the Labour case for reform. A Labour government will protect the gains that have benefited our people, while energetically pushing for progressive reform in Europe, in alliance with our allies across the continent, a vision of Europe of cooperation and solidarity. We can reform. We can reform to get a better deal for consumers, to strengthen workers' rights across Europe and prevent the undercutting of wages, to meet the challenges posed by migration and the refugee crisis. There has to be a humanitarian approach to the refugee crisis, not blame the victims. Not to blame the victims of wars all over Europe and all over the Middle East and elsewhere. And also to end the pressure to privatise our public services, to bring greater democracy to the European Union's institutions, and to bring them closer to people, and for reforms that generate prosperity across Europe for the benefit of all. Many people will be taking a European holiday in the coming months. They'll be benefiting from lower airfares and cheaper roaming charges on their mobile phones. But there are other areas where, working with our political allies in Europe and the 27 other countries representing over 450 million people, we can use our collective negotiating power to stop corporations taking consumers to the cleaners. A few weeks ago, I raised with the Prime Minister, and I'll be raising it with him continuously until he agrees, the need to reform. You'd be surprised how determined I can be. The need to reform the Posting of Workers Directive. This would close the loophole that allows workers from one country to work in another and be paid less than the local workers doing exactly the same job. The government must sign that agreement. Instances are actually relatively few, but such incidents undermine community cohesion by exploiting migrant workers and undercutting local workers and creating awful local tensions. This loophole only benefits unscrupulous employers seeking to drive down wages. And we, the Labour Party, are pressing the UK government to back the proposals that are on the table to close the loophole. It's not migrants that undercut wages, but unscrupulous employers that do so. Migrant workers. Migrant workers are often victims of the worst exploitation. It's our duty to close loopholes and strengthen an enforcement of employment protection here in Britain and across Europe, and we will do that. A couple of months ago, I had talks with the Greek Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras, who was elected on a clear anti-austerity platform to resolve his country's financial crisis. The way in which Greece has been treated by its creditors, including the European Central Bank, shows that Europe has to develop fairer and more effective mechanisms to manage such crises in the future. No one benefits from enforcing unpayable debt with yet more destructive austerity, and the ties of solidarity are undermined by such counterproductive action. Although Greece has suffered from enforced austerity, the Greek president and the Greek people are clear they want to stay within a reformed European Union. That was the basis of the discussions I had with Alexis and other ministers in the Greek government. There must be a Europe that works together to develop a strategy for renewed and shared growth. and for the gains of that growth to be shared more equally. Thousands of people have written to me with concerns, deep concerns, about the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. The deal being negotiated largely in secret between the US and EU officials. Many are concerned, quite rightly, that it could open up public services to further privatisation and make privatisation effectively irreversible. Others are concerned about potential watering down of consumer rights, food safety standards, rights at work or environmental protections. And a facility for corporations to take national governments to court if regulations impinged on their profits. I've read a great deal about this, I've thought a great deal about it, and I absolutely share all of those concerns that have been expressed by those opposed to TTIP. A few weeks ago, the French President, François Hollande, said that he would veto the deal as it stands, and to become law, any deal would have to be ratified by each member state. So today, we give this pledge. As it stands, we too would reject TTIP and veto it in government. And there's a challenge to the Prime Minister. If it's not good enough for France or good enough for other people, it's not good enough for us either. Let's be clear about that. David Cameron makes clear, now that Britain votes to remain this month, I ask him, will you block any TTIP trade treaty that threatens our public services, our consumer rights and our employment gains, or that hands power over to giant corporations to override democratically elected governments? The issue of the power of global corporations over democratic government is a huge one. TTIP is at the very epicentre of that debate. That is why I take such a strong line on TTIP, to assert the democratic rights of people to elect their governments in order to act to defend them against the power of global corporations. We need to be together to win those arguments, not isolated. The EU's state aid rules, which limit the scope for governments to intervene to support our vital industries, also need to change. But so does how British governments interpret them. The steel crisis highlighted how Germany, Italy, France and Spain all did much better at protecting their steel industries. They acted within EU state aid rules to support their industries, whether through taking a public stake, investing in research and development, providing loan guarantees or compensating for energy costs. Nevertheless, I still think the rules are too restrictive and that national governments must have the powers to act to protect key industries like the steel industry. And we look forward to the British government acting rapidly to ensure that Port Talbot is protected in the difficult days that all the workers and unions at Port Talbot are facing at the present time. We're committed to bringing railways into public ownership, and that is the democratic will of the public and the democratic will of our party and our movement. That's why our members of the European Parliament are scrutinising the fourth rail package currently being negotiated in the European Parliament to ensure there is no obstacle to a fully socially owned rail network in Britain. That's what we want to achieve, and that's what we're intending to achieve. More widely, we need to reform in Europe to ensure that we put a stop to the drive to privatise and break up our public services and utilities. The experience of Britain's many failed privatisations and the damage done by the outsourcing of our public services is an object lesson into why the pressure to continue this 3 decades-old experiment be brought to an end here and across Europe. Privatisation and agency working are the bedevilment of much of local government and of our health service. We want the right as national governments to protect to protect our public services, to deliver the best services for the people that absolutely need them. When it comes to the refugee crisis, many European countries have made great efforts in response, whether taking large numbers of people fleeing persecution or funding refugee camps in Lebanon and Turkey, as Britain had done. But collectively, as a continent, we have to be honest about it, we've failed to coordinate our efforts properly. Failed those countries like Greece and Italy that have seen desperate people land on their shores in unprecedented numbers. And tragically, we have failed people who desperately need and deserve our help. These are human beings, just like every one of us in this room, trying to survive in a difficult and dangerous world. Let us extend the hand of humanity to them. So we in the Labour Party are determined that this failure must never be allowed to happen again, and that in future we coordinate our efforts as a continent, across the whole continent. On migration into every country, we cannot deny the inevitable. We live in a smaller world. Most of us in Britain know someone who has studied, worked or retired abroad. We have reciprocal arrangements with the European Union. Our citizens, well over 1 million of them, live in other European Union countries, and EU citizens come to live and work here. But it's not that simple. I've already talked about how some industries are affected by the undercutting of wages and that action can be taken to tackle that. But some communities can change dramatically and rapidly, and that can be disconcerting for some people. That doesn't make all of them Little Englanders, xenophobes or racists. More people living in an area can put real pressure on local services like doctors, schools and housing. That is not the fault of the migrants, it's the failure of government. And the coalition government in 2010 abolished the Migrant Impact Fund, a national fund to manage the short-term impacts of migration on local communities. By abolishing it, David Cameron's then coalition government undermined the proper preparation and investment that communities need to adapt. We're clear. We would restore such a fund, and it could be managed through a combination of using EU underspend and reprioritising money from outdated existing European Union schemes. We cannot and should not want to close the borders, not for European citizens wanting to come here, tens of thousands of whom work in our National Health Service, and not for British citizens who want to take advantage of opportunities to study and work elsewhere in Europe. But we do have to make sure that public services are able to sustain the communities we have here. Part of that is through the Migrant Impact Fund. And partly, too, it's about reversing the damaging, unnecessary austerity policies that this government continues to impose on our communities and the people of this country. We, the Labour Party, are overwhelmingly for staying in, because we believe the European Union has brought investment, jobs and protection for workers, consumers and the environment. But also because we recognise that our membership offers a crucial role to meeting the challenges that we all face in the 21st century. Climate change, restraining the power of global corporation and ensuring they pay fair taxes both in Europe and chase down the tax havens all around the world. Also, on tackling cybercrime and terrorism, and ensuring trade is fair with protections for workers and consumers, and in addressing refugee movements. Britain will be stronger if we cooperate with our neighbours in facing these challenges together. Europe absolutely needs to change. I've outlined some areas for progressive reform. but these changes can only be achieved by working with our allies. There is an overwhelming case to remain and reform so that we build on the best that Europe has achieved. But that will only happen if we elect a Labour government in Britain committed to engaging with our allies to deliver real improvements to the lives of the people of our country. That's why we established the Labour In campaign, because we have a distinct agenda, a vision to make Britain better and fairer for everyone by engaging with our neighbours. So when you vote on the 23rd of June, I hope you vote to remain and then campaign with us on the 24th of June onwards for the reforms, solidarity and changes that we need all across this continent. We can and will make big changes. That is what the Labour Party is all about. Thank you very much.